Welcome, Cosinons. Power doesn't reveal who you are when you win. It reveals who you are when you're outnumbered. Now let me ask you this. Did you know that throughout history, armies have collapsed not because they lacked weapons, but because one single strategist dismantled their entire formation? Alexander the Great, Hannibal, even modern warfare analysts, they'll all tell you the same truth. Numbers can look intimidating, but numbers without coordination are just noise in uniform. That's exactly why this story shakes the ground. Because you, yes, you, a so-called one-man army, stood toe-to-toe against a coordinated gang of witches, manipulators and schemers, and walked away not just alive, but victorious. They weren't just startled, they were petrified, terrified, shaken down to the marrow. Because here's the cosmic joke. Their unity turned into their liability the moment you refused to be a predictable target. See, groups like that feed off illusion, the drama of being many. But you proved what history has been whispering for centuries. One clear mind, one unshaken soul, one sharpened spirit is more effective than a crowd tangled in its own lies. And the look on their faces, priceless, like a bunch of magicians who accidentally pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Only the rabbit had receipts, a spine of steel, and zero interest in playing along. Stay tuned, because by the end of this, you'll see why their fear of you wasn't paranoia. It was prophecy fulfilled. And maybe, just maybe, you'll laugh at how little it actually took to bring their empire of spells down to nothing more than smoke and excuses. Number 1, you weaponized your wound into the decisive strategy of victory. That is the kind of statement people often overlook because most assume pain only breaks you. What they don't realize is that pain, when studied instead of suppressed, becomes a blueprint. Every betrayal, every backstab, every false smile was a classroom where you sat silently taking notes. You didn't just hurt. You learned the anatomy of manipulation, the rhythm of lies, the fragile egos behind the performance. That's why when the group came against you, you weren't reacting blindly. You already had a library of strategies filed inside you from every wound you ever carried. This is where your victory was different from theirs. They thought their power came from numbers, spells, or intimidation. But you understood something far deeper. Repetition creates predictability. They weren't as mysterious as they thought. Their tricks ran in cycles. They tried guilt, then slander, then isolation, then intimidation, like a script you'd already read 100 times. While they thought they were improvising, you knew the next act before they spoke their lines. That's what made you terrifying to them. You dismantled them, not with louder force, but with an eerie calm that only comes from someone who has studied pain long enough to know its every disguise. And here's the brutal truth. They never studied themselves. They never sat with their own wounds or questioned their motives. They numbed, they projected, they acted in packs, so they didn't have to face the mirror alone. But you faced the mirror so many times, it became a weapon. You turned trauma into tactical clarity. You knew exactly how far they'd go. And more importantly, you knew the moment they'd overstep. When that moment came, you didn't flinch. You redirected it. That's why one person could feel like an army. Not because you were swinging harder or shouting louder, but because you weren't fighting only in the present moment. You were fighting with the memory of every previous wound, sharpened into foresight. That foresight is what broke them. That's what turned the tables. They thought they were attacking scars, but those scars had become your map, and you navigated straight through their chaos and came out with the win. Number 2, their power rested on assumption. You removed the assumption and collapsed their castle of cards. That's the part that shook them the most. They had built their entire confidence on the idea that you would act like everyone else they had manipulated before. They assumed you would crumble under pressure, defend yourself in desperation, or seek their approval to prove your worth. Every move they planned relied on that script, and when you refused to play it, their foundation cracked instantly. What most people don't realize is that groups like this don't operate on real strength. They operate on rehearsed patterns. They tell themselves, if we accuse, they'll panic. If we isolate, they'll chase. If we mock, they'll shrink. That sequence is their safety net, and they've rehearsed it so often they believe it's unshakable. But the moment you stepped outside of that dance, their choreography fell apart. Instead of defending yourself frantically, you stayed quiet. Instead of chasing their acceptance, you walked away. Instead of internalizing their accusations, you questioned their logic out loud. That single refusal to move the way they expected turned their performance into a clumsy scramble. And here's the irony. The assumption wasn't just about you. It was about themselves too. They assumed they were smarter, more united, and untouchable. But your disruption exposed something they didn't want anyone to see. Their coordination was fragile. Without a predictable enemy, they weren't organized. They were chaotic individuals hiding behind the illusion of unity. That's why everything started unraveling so fast. The gang wasn't a fortress. It was a pile of egos leaning on each other for balance. Once you shifted the weight, they toppled over themselves. This is why your victory was so unnerving to them. You didn't shout them down or match them blow for blow. You did something scarier. You made their own strategy irrelevant. Their assumptions weren't just wrong. They were exposed as childish tricks. They wanted to prove they were in control. But you revealed they were only in control when the opponent played along. That revelation spread faster than any rumor they tried to create. People watching could see it too. The strength they boasted about was only a costume. You stripped it away simply by refusing to be predictable. And in that moment, the castle they built out of assumptions collapsed into dust. Number 3, you learned the enemy's language and then used it to translate their crimes into evidence. That's what made your stand different from empty resistance. They spoke in riddles, whispers, and coded gestures meant to confuse and disarm anyone who tried to understand them. To outsiders, their manipulation looked like harmless conversation, a slip of words, or even concern disguised as care. But you weren't an outsider. You had lived in the middle of their games long enough to recognize the patterns, the tones, the rehearsed phrases that carried more meaning than what was said. You decoded their language, and once you understood it, you stripped them of their greatest weapon, secrecy. This is why they panicked. Their power depended on ambiguity, on being able to say one thing and mean another, while convincing everyone else that the misunderstanding was your fault. But you broke that cycle by attaching every phrase, every act, every sly performance to facts. When they mocked you under the guise of a joke, you tracked the consistency of those jokes. When they played victim to mask their aggression, you logged the timing of when those roles shifted. You weren't just listening, you were archiving. You weren't just hurt, you were mapping. And when you brought those maps to light, their hidden dialect of deceit turned into plain evidence anyone could read. The brilliance of this wasn't in yelling louder. It was in showing receipts. When people saw how words lined up with actions, how repeated phrases covered the same abuses, how their innocent comments were always timed with attacks, the veil fell. That's the part that made you unstoppable. You didn't accuse, you revealed, you didn't need to exaggerate. You translated. Translation is dangerous for deceivers because it removes the safety of plausible deniability. Once their language was decoded, their defense crumbled. What unnerved them most was realizing you spoke fluently in both worlds, theirs and the world of truth. They had spent so long creating a private dialect of manipulation that they assumed it was unbreakable. But you learned it so well that you could stand in both spaces, hearing their intent while exposing their liesto, everyone else in words too clear to twist. That double fluency turned their secrets into evidence and their pride into panic. It wasn't just that you survived their language. You mastered it, and then you used it to dismantle their entire story. Number 4, you made humility into a containment field for deceit. Most people misunderstand humility, thinking it's weakness, passivity, or being invisible. They never expected to be intentional, tactical, or protective. But that's exactly what you turned it into. You didn't need to announce your moves or prove your point with noise, because every calculated step you took was enough to contain their lies, control their narrative, and force their own chaos to reveal itself. While they were busy projecting arrogance, you were quietly building clarity. Your approach looked small at first, a nod here, a silent observation there, a calm refusal to react to provocation. To the casual observer, it seemed like restraint, patience, or even disinterest. But those small, measured actions were actually walls around their ability to manipulate the situation. They couldn't push you into their predictable reactions because you didn't react in the way they needed. They tried to provoke you, gaslight you, or lure you into drama. But your humility acted as a barrier, a field they couldn't penetrate, hit a wall of calm that they didn't know how to break. Here's the part that terrified them. People separate humility from power. They think being humble means being weak, compliant, or invisible. You proved that's a lie. You married humility with strategy, patience, and unshakable focus. That marriage is explosive. It allows you to operate under the radar while controlling the board in ways the loudest, most aggressive people cannot. Every time they assumed they were winning because you were quiet, you were actually repositioning, analyzing, and methodically dismantling their illusions from the inside out. The shock comes when the quiet person, the one they dismissed, underestimated, and mocked, becomes the one who exposes the truth. They don't see the containment field forming until it's too late. And by the time the deception collapses, the person they thought they could manipulate has already rewritten the rules of engagement. They thought humility was a weakness. You proved it was your strongest weapon. Your silence wasn't empty. Your patience wasn't passive, and your calm wasn't powerless. It was the strategy that unraveled everything they thought they controlled, leaving them staring at a quiet force they never anticipated and could never contain. Number 5, you created allies out of doubt by telling truth in ways that compelled curiosity, not defensiveness. Most people confront manipulation with anger, accusation, or confrontation, and the reaction is predictable. The group closes ranks, doubles down, and paints the truth-teller as the enemy. You didn't fall into that trap. Instead, you understood that curiosity is more powerful than confrontation. By sharing facts, observations, or small revelations in a way that sparked questions rather than defensiveness, you allowed others to arrive at the truth themselves. That subtle method shifts the burden from you to them, making them complicit in uncovering what the manipulators tried to hide. This isn't passive, it's precise. You didn't need a crowd to witness your actions or an audience to validate your perspective. You planted seeds of doubt in ways that felt natural to observers. A question here, a pointed observation there. Moments that lingered in people's minds and made them question the stories they had been told. Instead of telling people what to think, you guided them to ask, how could this be true? That single question cracks open defensive walls and lets curiosity replace reflexive loyalty. Once curiosity enters, skepticism follows. And skepticism is deadly to manipulative groups because it forces them to justify their behavior in real time, often exposing contradictions they couldn't cover. Turning suspicion into a magnet for truth is a skill few possess because it requires self-control, timing, and an understanding of human psychology. You had all three in abundance. While the gang assumed their network of control was airtight, you were quietly converting their own members into observers who began tracking inconsistencies, questioning motives, and noticing patterns. Those who once defended the group instinctively found themselves examining evidence without anyone telling them to. By the time open conflict arrived, the gang had already fractured. Their cohesion was broken not by a loud battle or public accusation, but by the quiet, surgical method of compelling curiosity. People who might have been neutral or even slightly aligned with the manipulators turned into allies simply because you allowed them to discover the truth on their own terms. That is the rare kind of power that doesn't announce itself, but leaves a lasting impact. Your victory was never about winning a fight. It was about teaching others to see the fight for themselves. Number 6, you understood that fear is contagious. So you made it contagious in reverse. Most manipulators rely on one simple principle. Terror spreads faster than reason. They know that when people are afraid, they comply, hesitate, and allow themselves to be controlled. That is their ultimate leverage. But you didn't play their game. You realized that the same mechanism that spreads fear can also spread courage, determination, and clarity. Your refusal to be intimidated didn't just protect you. It radiated outward, disrupting the entire ecosystem of manipulation. By standing calm and resolute, you demonstrated to others that the consequences they feared weren't inevitable. Observers saw that your resolve didn't waver, that the threats, lies, and intimidation tactics didn't move you an inch. That simple observation was infectious. People who had been paralyzed by dread began to question the power structure that had held them hostage. They realized that fear had only been a tool, not an unstoppable force. Your courage became proof that compliance was optional, and that realization spread faster than any warning the manipulators could issue. The paradox of fear is striking. It can move through a group like a virus, silencing voices and controlling actions. But the same is true for resolve. Once a few individuals stop being afraid, their confidence ignites curiosity and reflection in others. Suddenly, the manipulator's network starts to unravel. Their threats no longer carry weight. Their tactics no longer produce panic. And their authority becomes performative rather than real. What was once a structure of control now looks fragile, and the people who had been compliant are suddenly questioning every narrative. You became the carrier for that shift. Your presence, your calm, your refusal to bend became the invisible hand that turned fear into courage. It didn't require shouting, confrontation, or spectacle. Only the steady demonstration that you were unshakable. That is why they were scared to death. They had relied on fear as their ultimate weapon. And you not only disarmed it, but used it against them in a way they couldn't anticipate. Fear, which had always been their ally, became irrelevant because your resolve moved faster, stronger, and more contagiously than they ever imagined. You didn't just survive, you became the spark that dissolved the chains they thought were unbreakable. Number 7, you refuse the currency they trade in. Shame used as leverage. Manipulators rely on one simple truth. Most people will do anything to avoid feeling embarrassed, guilty, or exposed. That fear of shame is their currency, their power, their control. They turn every mistake, hesitation, or misstep inward, making you believe you are the problem. It's subtle, quiet, and corrosive, almost invisible until you're deeply entangled. But you refuse to accept their economy of guilt. You refuse to pay in the coin they demanded. Instead of internalizing their attacks, you externalize them. You observed, documented, and identified patterns in behavior that revealed the real source of the problem. Every manipulation, every lie, every attempt to twist your words became part of a record that existed outside of yourself. By turning their actions into facts, by mapping behaviors instead of absorbing blame, you denied them the ability to weaponize shame against you. You didn't react with guilt. You reacted with clarity. That's what makes this method so devastating. People who rely on moral blackmail aren't prepared for someone who refuses to participate in their economy. Shame is usually invisible, but its effects ripple. It isolates, destabilizes, and controls. When you refuse to internalize it, the manipulator's control collapsed quietly but completely. They could threaten, mock, or gaslight all they wanted. But without your participation in their ledger, their system had no value. You weren't flashy about it, didn't need to call them out publicly, and didn't need dramatic confrontation. Your refusal alone stripped their currency of meaning. The brilliance of this approach is that it doesn't just protect you, it bankrupts the system that relied on your compliance. Groups built on manipulation, lies, and shame only function when others validate their control. Remove that validation, and the entire structure becomes fragile, unworkable, and exposed. By refusing shame as a medium of exchange, you rewrote the rules of engagement. You didn't just survive their attacks. You turned their strongest weapon into an empty threat, leaving them powerless in the face of a quiet, methodical, and unshakable force. Number 8, you made your moral center operational rather than rhetorical. Most people talk about values, morals, or principles, but in manipulative environments, talk is cheap and often weaponized as a shield. Words like honor, tradition, or community are thrown around, not as guidance, but as armor to protect those who exploit, deceive, or manipulate behind closed doors. They rely on others taking their words at face value while hiding contradictions, lies, or hidden agendas. You saw through that, and instead of joining their theater of rhetoric, you made your moral center visible through action. You didn't just say what you believed. You created tangible rules and standards that reflected those beliefs, and you applied them consistently. Transparency wasn't optional. It was a practice. Records weren't casual. They were deliberate. Witnesses weren't chosen for convenience. They were part of a system that held everyone, including yourself, accountable. By operationalizing your values in this way, you created a framework that could be observed, verified, and relied upon. And that framework became a mirror showing everyone else where their rhetoric failed. When they tried to claim authority, morality, or virtue, their actions were measured against your operational integrity. And the contrast was devastating. This approach is powerful because integrity that functions cannot be manipulation or persuasion. It exists in reality, in patterns, in results, whereas rhetoric can be argued, twisted, or dismissed. Operational integrity forces exposure. Those who hide behind words suddenly appear hollow when faced with someone whose morality isn't just talked about, but performed, documented, and undeniable. What they underestimated is that this method doesn't just protect you. It destabilizes the system built on performative ethics. They counted on confusion, selective truth, and moral gray areas to maintain control. By consistently living your values as observable rules, you made it impossible for them to manipulate perception. Every inconsistency, every hidden agenda, every lie became visible against the benchmark of your actions. You didn't need confrontation, accusations, or theatrics. Your operational integrity did the work silently, relentlessly, and indisputably. It exposed hypocrisy, revealed patterns of deceit, and showed everyone that true moral power isn't spoken, it's executed. Number 9, you weaponized patience as an accelerant for collapse. Most people think patience is passive, something you do when you can't act, or a quiet form of surrender. You understood that patience, when applied strategically, is the opposite. It's an active force, a tool to expose, analyze, and dismantle. While manipulators rush, push, and try to force outcomes, you allowed them the space to perform, to act out their scripts, and to show their true selves. Every hurried lie, every impulsive attack, every overconfident maneuver became a piece of evidence you collected without interruption. Their eagerness to control the narrative and finish their stories quickly was their undoing. They didn't realize that in rushing to prove themselves, they were creating a trail. Timelines slipped. Statements contradicted earlier claims. Alliances revealed fractures, and moments intended to intimidate became admissions of guilt. You weren't chasing. You were observing. You weren't reacting. You were recording patterns. The very speed they believed would secure them dominance provided you with the forensic material needed to expose their schemes comprehensively. Patience in this context isn't about waiting idly. It's about creating conditions where the truth becomes self-evident. By letting them overreach, you amplified the cracks in their structure. Each inconsistency, each misstep became sharper under the lens of your calm observation. Their attempts to manipulate were neutralized, not by confrontation, but by the quiet accumulation of evidence and clarity. The beauty of weaponized patience is that it forces the manipulators to act within the boundaries they cannot control. Every lie they told, every manipulation they tried, every attempt to provoke a reaction was turned against them. They thought time was on their side, but by controlling your own timing, you inverted that advantage. Their energy, aggression, and desperation accelerated their collapse. While your composed vigilance ensured that nothing was missed, by the time action became necessary, you had everything in place. Their own haste had built the case against them, and you simply executed the final steps. Patience wasn't weakness. It was your methodology. It wasn't quietness. It was precision. It wasn't waiting for a mistake. It was creating the conditions where mistakes became unavoidable, undeniable, and irreversible. You turned their momentum into your weapon, proving that restraint, when used strategically, can dismantle even the most confident opposition. Number 10, you used scarcity of reaction, of validation, of spectacle as a power move. Manipulators thrive on attention. They feed on the reactions, emotions, and energy of others, turning every response into fuel for their control. Anger, fear, shame, or even curiosity all become part of their system, sustaining the narrative they want the world to see. You recognize this and refuse to supply it. You didn't play into their games, didn't amplify their drama, and didn't validate their twisted sense of importance. Every time they expected a response, you withheld it, and that silence became a weapon. This scarcity forced them into escalation. When the usual levers of influence failed, they had no choice but to overextend. They acted out more aggressively, revealing patterns and intentions they had carefully hidden. Without your reactions to mask their behavior, every attempt to intimidate, manipulate, or provoke became visible. The raw, unfiltered actions they took in those moments were evidence, not just for you, but for anyone observing. What they thought would control the narrative only exposed it. The brilliance of using scarcity this way is that it doesn't require confrontation. You didn't need to fight, shout, or defend yourself. Your restraint forced them to overplay, and their overplay revealed their weakness. The absence of reaction became a lens through which the truth was amplified. Observers could see the manipulation for what it was without your commentary or intervention, because the manipulators were showing their true face in real time. Here's the aha moment. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't something you do, it's something you refuse to do. By denying them the fuel they depended on, you controlled the environment while letting them reveal themselves. Every escalation, every overstep, every desperate display became their undoing. They couldn't adapt to a situation where their audience refused to cooperate, and that refusal shattered their illusions of power. In denying them validation and spectacle, you made scarcity itself a tool, turning inaction into strategy, silence into exposure, and withdrawal into dominance. Number 11. You turn the psychology of the pack against itself by documenting the micro-betrayals. Groups appear strong because they project unity, but their cohesion depends on countless tiny agreements, promises, and loyalties. Each small breach, each unkempt promise, each secret kept from others is a crack in the armor. You noticed these micro-betrayals and treated them not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a larger puzzle. By recording every small fracture, who hid what, who failed to follow through, who contradicted themselves, you built a pattern that no amount of denial could erase. This is where your strategy becomes devastating. Manipulative groups rely on perception as much as reality. If no one notices the inconsistencies, if no one collects the evidence, the group remains untouchable. You changed that. Every tiny infraction was tracked and folded into a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. Individual denials were powerless once the pattern existed. What seemed small to the manipulators, a whispered lie here, a broken promise there, became an unstoppable chain of proof when documented and connected. The brilliance is in the relentlessness. You didn't need one dramatic revelation to bring the group down. You didn't rely on confrontation or explosive exposure. Instead, you let the accumulation of evidence work quietly, persistently. Each micro-betrayal added weight. Each observation added clarity. Slowly, the structure that had seemed solid began to wobble. Members who once defended the group could no longer ignore the pattern, and internal trust eroded without anyone needing to intervene directly. This approach is surgical. It exploits the natural psychology of groups, their dependence on shared stories, their need for cohesion, and their fear of being exposed. By turning the pack's own mechanics against it, you destabilize them from within. Their strength, unity, secrecy, and mutual protection became their vulnerability. What they counted on to maintain control ultimately ensured their undoing. The power wasn't in confrontation or spectacle. It was in meticulous observation, documentation, and the patient construction of truth from countless small moments they believed were insignificant. In the end, the quiet collection of micro-betrayals achieved more than any loud accusation ever could. Number 12, you refused to be mythologized and instead insisted on being human, and that broke their legend. Manipulative groups thrive on myths. They craft stories about themselves that make them untouchable, infallible, or morally superior. Their power depends on people believing in these exaggerated images rather than the reality behind the curtain. They want followers to see leaders as flawless, cliques as righteous, and opposition as weak or undeserving. That illusion is what keeps control in place. But you refused to participate in their fantasy. You insisted on being human, flawed, accountable, honest, and consistent. By showing your humanity, you shattered the narrative they had carefully built. People around them began to notice the contrast. A real person standing in front of them versus a manufactured legend. Your willingness to admit mistakes, maintain transparency, and act with integrity exposed the gap between myth and reality. Suddenly, the carefully constructed image of invincibility, righteousness, or superiority became hollow. Observers could see the human cost of their myths, the manipulation, the contradictions, the hidden agendas, because it was no longer obscured by fear or reverence. The collapse of a legend is often more destructive than external accusations. When a group realizes that its foundation was built on illusions rather than substance, trust fractures from within. Members begin questioning decisions, motives, and alliances. Those who once defended the myth start seeing cracks, doubting loyalties, and recalibrating their allegiance. The power the group relied on evaporates, not because someone shouted accusations, but because the story they depended on lost credibility. What made your approach so devastating is that it required no theatrics, no spectacle, and no public confrontation. You revealed the impossible standard they had imposed on themselves. The myth that sustained their dominance couldn't withstand the weight of reality. Your authenticity became a weapon, exposing their vulnerabilities and forcing the group to confront truths they had long ignored. In the end, the dismantling of a legend from within is permanent. The image may linger in memory, but the control it held is gone, and the group is left vulnerable, disoriented, and exposed. Number 13. You converted perceived vulnerability into a strategic mirror that reflected their true faces. Manipulators thrive on the illusion of power, and their favorite tactic is to identify what they think is your weakness. They probe, and attack, convinced that exploiting this vulnerability will prove their superiority. Most people respond with fear, defensiveness, or overreaction, which only reinforces the manipulator's sense of control. You did the opposite. You treated their attacks not as threats to be defended against, but as a lens through which their true intentions could be revealed. Every attempt to provoke or dominate you became an opportunity to document, corroborate, and clarify. Recorded conversations, written accounts, and patterns of behavior turned their attacks into undeniable evidence. Your calm, steady responses acted like a mirror. Instead of absorbing the attack, you reflected it back in a form that made their strategies visible to everyone, including themselves. This method doesn't punish, it exposes. It doesn't escalate, it clarifies. The moment they see their own behavior objectively reflected, the mystique they relied on for control starts to crumble. The power of the mirror is in its subtlety. It forces manipulators to confront the consequences of their own actions without needing you to act aggressively or retaliate. Their attempts to manipulate or intimidate no longer function in secrecy because every move is mirrored back through documentation, calm observation, and visible consistency. They are forced into a position where their tactics can be analyzed, questioned, and understood by others. This approach is devastating because it turns the manipulator's energy against them. They spend so much time trying to project power and fear, but your strategic response redirects that energy into transparency. Every calculated attack strengthens the case against them. Every attempt to exploit weakness only reinforces the mirror. By converting vulnerability into a tool, you not only protect yourself, but also dismantle the illusion of control that kept the group cohesive. Clarity replaces fear, observation replaces chaos, and the mystique they relied on disappears. The more they try to assert dominance, the more their true faces are revealed, and the more unstoppable your position becomes. Number 14. Your final victory was not in destruction, but in rewriting the rules so they can't rebuild the same game. Most people think winning means tearing down enemies, exposing them, or publicly humiliating them. That's superficial. True victory lies deeper in changing the environment so that their old tactics no longer work. You didn't just topple people. You reshaped the system. You established new expectations, introduced rigorous documentation standards, and determined who gets heard and trusted. By doing this, you made the structures they relied on, secrecy, manipulation, and performative control, obsolete. This kind of victory is quieter, but infinitely more powerful. The manipulators may have thought their power rested in intimidation, alliances, or public perception, but you shifted the ground underneath them. Every future attempt to operate under their old rules would fail because you rewrote the framework. The barriers that once protected them, opacity, unquestioned authority, selective loyalty, no longer exist. You didn't just break their game. You made sure they could never play it the same way again. What makes this approach devastating is that it doesn't rely on spectacle. There's no dramatic confrontation or public showdown. Instead, it's systemic. By creating a new environment where truth, accountability, and observation govern interactions. You remove the advantage from their toolkit. Any attempt to manipulate or intimidate now meets structural resistance. Their confidence erodes, their strategies falter, and their fear returns, not of confrontation, but of irrelevance and exposure. The genius of this final move is that it ensures permanence. While dramatic victories can fade or be reversed, changing the rules changes the playing field permanently. They can no longer rely on the same tricks, lies, or methods to maintain control. Their old power structures are dead, and every attempt to rebuild triggers the safeguards you put in place. Your victory is not just survival, it's transformation. You didn't just defeat them. You made the arena unrecognizable, leaving them afraid, disoriented, and powerless while you stand secure, unchallenged, and in control. The story of your triumph isn't just about defeating a group or surviving manipulation. It's about redefining power itself. You turned wounds into strategy, patience into a weapon, and humility into a shield that exposed deception. You transformed fear into courage, silence into dominance, and perceived weakness into a mirror that reflected the truth back at those who thought they controlled you. Every calculated step, every quiet observation, and every refusal to play by their rules didn't just dismantle them. It reshaped the entire battlefield so their old tricks could no longer survive. This wasn't about spectacle or dramatic confrontation. Your victory was systemic, subtle, and permanent. You rewrote the rules, exposed the myth of their invincibility, and created conditions where manipulation, lies, and secrecy could no longer thrive. The power that once belonged to them now exists in the clarity, resilience, and integrity you embody. They were scared, not because you destroyed them publicly, but because you made their methods irrelevant. Their fear is the proof of your mastery. The acknowledgement that one unshakable strategic and perceptive mind is worth more than an entire gang of manipulators. Let this be a reminder. True power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it observes, calculates, and acts with precision. Sometimes it bends the battlefield without ever showing its hand. And when it does, the results are undeniable. You didn't just survive the war. You mastered it, turning every attempt to control you into evidence, exposure, and eventual collapse. If this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your journey, your strength, and your clarity matter, and sharing this knowledge could help someone else finally see the truth behind the games they've been forced to play. This is more than a story of victory. It's a blueprint for anyone determined to turn manipulation into mastery. God bless you,